Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Jon Marinaro. He's a critical care physician. Today's Kevin MD article is The Hidden Flaws of Traditional CPR, Why We Need a New Approach to Save Lives. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited to speak on what is a very large show.
All right. So before we start, just briefly share your story and journey.
Yeah, I'm Jon Marinaro. I'm a critical care physician from the University of New Mexico. I did the emergency medicine critical care pathway and did my residency in emergency medicine at the University of New Mexico, and then went to shock trauma in Baltimore and did a trauma critical care fellowship and finished there, came back to the University of New Mexico, and I've been there since 2003 or 2005 actually, and have been the director of several ICUs here and now the chief of critical care for the University Health System and the director of the adult ECMO program here.
All right, excellent. Let's talk about your Kevin MD article, The Hidden Flaws of Traditional CPR, Why We Need a New Approach to Save Lives. For those of you who get a chance to read your article, tell us what it's about.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. So in 1956 or so, Peter Safar came up with CPR, right? Pushing on the chest saves lives. From 1956 till about 2000, that was the only thing we did for a person in cardiac arrest that was kind of generally like everybody in the world could do. And then around 2000, Paul Pepe and Lance Becker published a paper about putting defibrillators in airports and how they really changed the outcome of a lot of different patients. Their paper is really a great paper to read, and it talked about how if you can rapidly apply a defibrillator to a person immediately after cardiac arrest, the survival rates jump up enormously. And so right now, current out-of-hospital cardiac survival rates are about 8.5% of those people survive neurologically intact. Other than that, 91.5% die or are neurologically devastated and die. And so with the addition of the defibrillator, if that defibrillator is applied early, you can actually save up to about 35 to 40% of people with neurologically intact survival. Outside of that, most people die if they have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And so what the paper is about is using ECMO, which is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, applied emergently during CPR within an hour of the cardiac arrest to save more lives. And what we have shown, the various centers around the nation that do this, that if you apply this rapidly, you actually triple the survival rate. We're getting around a 30% survival rate for cardiac arrest from the 8.5%. And these are all people that have failed the defibrillator. So this is that subset of patients that never really had the chance. In the olden days, the person would get CPR, they'd get shocked, they don't survive, and they die. As a matter of fact, in November of last year, the American Heart Association moved ECMO to higher than amiodarone for refractory VTAC and VFib cardiac arrest.
So those who aren't familiar with ECMO, tell us about the device itself and the physiology behind it.
Absolutely. So ECMO is essentially, it's kind of like cardiac bypass, but it's applied percutaneously in the emergency department or in the ICU, or for some of us who are doing this in the field. And basically you put a cannula, which is like a large drainage tube in the venous system. So usually up into the intrahepatic IVC, you drain out, you go through a pump that pressurizes it, goes through an oxygenator, which removes CO2, it adds oxygen, and then shoots it back into the left femoral artery, common femoral artery, and provides perfusion to the organs. Interestingly enough, 75 to 78% of all cardiac arrests die because their brain doesn't get saved. It's not because their heart doesn't come back. So you can get the heart back, but you can't save the brain. So like the first 5 to 10 minutes of any cardiac arrest is about saving the heart, so then you can save the brain. After about 5 to 10 minutes, when you've shocked that person 2 to 3 times, you really need to move into like, how do we save the brain? And that is where ECMO really helps, because those that don't respond to those first few shocks, the mortality just drops off substantially. Actually, I believe it is at around, I might be wrong with this number, but I believe at 20 minutes, you have a 16% survival rate, I think is what it's at.
So practically speaking, what does that look like? So let's say someone in the ICU or an emergency department comes in cardiac arrest or goes into cardiac arrest, CPR, defibrillator, not responding, and then now you're considering ECMO. So practically speaking, what does that look like?
Yeah, so basically you have a witness cardiac arrest. You have 5 minutes for people to kind of stand around and look at the person and be like, what's going on? Because a lot of people think people are seizing or the patients are still gasping, because those are normal post-arrest things the body does. They look like they're seizing or they're still gasping. And people have to jump on that patient and do CPR. So once the CPR starts, the clock starts ticking for 55 more minutes. So you have a total of an hour. It's kind of like the final 60. Like there's the golden hour for
Yeah.
trauma, there's the final 60 for this. And you have 55 more minutes to get the person from the place they arrested to the hospital where they can be cannulated for ECMO. And they basically, you prep the groins, you put a needle in the common femoral vein, common femoral artery, put a wire up, dilate, put a cannula up, and turn the machine on. And you can do that. There's certain places around the world. Lionel Lamet in Paris with Alice Houghton, they do pre-hospital ECMO where they're cannulating people on the floor of the metro or in the Louvre. That's the famous pictures that are out there. Dr. Yiannopoulos and Dr. Bardos in Minneapolis have a mobile ECMO cannulation van. We actually have an ambulance that we've outfitted to do that. And so various places around the world are trying to bring ECMO to the patient. And then there's most places just do it in the hospital, in the ER is where they're doing it. Actually, in the Netherlands, Dennis Miranda has a helicopter-based pre-hospital ECMO service where they're flying a helicopter to, and they've shortened their time from arrest to time being on ECMO to 40 minutes from the moment of arrest to moment of being on flow.
So in the United States, how available is extracorporeal CPR?
Yeah, it's growing. So 10 years ago, this was like, what are you doing? You're crazy. This isn't going anywhere. Now across the US, most major centers are offering ECMO, like academic centers such as us. In San Diego, Sharp Memorial with Zach Shiner, Joe Belezzo, those guys they've trained 150 ER doctors up across the Sharp Memorial system that it is the standard of care. If you arrest in that Sharp Memorial area, you get on ECMO. The people in Los Angeles have a growing ECMO program, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Seattle, and all the way across the US. I'm obviously on the west part of the country, so I know those folks a lot better. But across the country, most major academic centers are offering some form of eCPR, and more smaller places. Jason Bowman at Ephraim Memorial in Kentucky actually offers it, and that's a smaller place. Chandler Hospital in Arizona, smaller place. They're offering it too.
Now, does it require specialized training on the physician standpoint? What are some of the barriers that's preventing a spread?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So, does it require specialized training? Well, for most ER docs and critical care docs, putting in central lines is regular training. And all we're doing is putting in bigger central lines. Now, when you start saying most people who go out and practice in the community may, after a few years, they stop putting in central lines. They do a lot of stuff through peripheral lines, and they let the specialist, maybe the surgeon or the critical care doc or whatever, put in the larger central lines. But these are really, it's a 15, I'm actually just about to hopefully publish a paper about a 13 French ECMO cannula, which is the arterial return, and a dialysis catheter is 13 French. So if you've ever put in dialysis catheters, it's about the same as that on the arterial side. The venous cannula is about the size of my index finger, and that's usually like a 25 French. And so that's really the special training. Who do you put on? Can you put in these big cannulas? And then you typically just need an ECMO specialist, which is almost every hospital has that, who has a perfusionist team. And they hand you the tubes, you turn on the machine and it goes. But the machines are getting simpler and simpler that you actually don't need like a super highly perfusionist trained. We use ECMO specialists, which are nurses and respiratory therapists who've just been through extra training, and they're super well qualified, but it's not quite the same as going to perfusionist school. So it's the goal. My entire career goal is to make ECMO to the masses, because you're not going to save people just being near University of New Mexico or near the University of Minneapolis. And you need to make this more widespread. And so really the goal of all of us should be to simplify this so that we can save more people, much like Lance Becker and Paul Pepe did with the defibrillator on the wall in the airport.
So just so I'm clear in terms of the outcome data, we're talking about a benefit not only in overall survival rate, but also in terms of intact neurological function after cardiac arrest?
Yeah, it basically, the national data is you have a 30% neurologically intact survival rate with using ECMO CPR, eCPR. And again, that is people who are typically getting on between 30 and 60 minutes after their cardiac arrest, which if you look without that, the survival rates in the single percentages. Like we say it triples survival, but a lot of that tripling is because you're taking the 8.5, which is all different levels of survival. This is like people who would have years ago we would have just stopped, but now we're continuing. And, I've put on people at an hour in 16 minutes and they've survived. And we've actually had hypothermic arrests. One person that was a 3 hours of CPR and they were neurologically attacked and left the hospital. And there's a number of stories. That's not like some random story. This is at these centers that do this is a common thing.
So you mentioned one of your goals is to bring ECMO and eCPR to the masses, like
Yeah.
in Paris, for instance. What's preventing your vision from happening? What are some of the immediate obstacles that prevents that?
Yeah, some of the immediate obstacles is technologically, the pumps are expensive, right? So
Mhm.
like if you look at like the cardio help pump, it's something like 125 or $150,000, probably depending on how many you buy for your hospital. And the disposables are 14 to $15,000. When you start making products that it's a wonderful product, the cardio help, the ECMO pump's a great product, but it's kind of complex. There's a lot of buttons and there's a lot of things, and you got to zero stuff and all this other stuff. When you start making devices that are kind of complex like that, it scares people off. And they're like,
Mhm.
oh, now I have to have an ECMO specialist. And now I have to this stuff. What we did actually initially in Albuquerque for our pre-hospital is when the mechanical pump goes down, you have a hand crank that powers the motor. And so in the back of our ambulance, for the first couple years we did this, we had just the hand crank that's not powered, and we had a firefighter just hand crank. And the only thing you needed to do was connect the tubes and have him crank, and you could get flow. And it works perfectly. It works just fine. We've now moved because we have enough machines and we have enough bodies that we could actually have an ECMO specialist in the back of the ambulance. But the whole point of the thing is you just need to beat CPR and you're going to save more lives. And so if you can simplify the process, smaller cannulas, easier setup, devices that are just a single squeeze or just something simple as opposed to all this other stuff, you're going to simplify the technology and make it somewhere like an intubation, right? 30, or maybe not 30, like 60 years ago, people probably were like, only an anesthesiologist could intubate a person. And now paramedics intubate. And, 50, 60 years ago, surgeons were probably like, you have to be a surgeon to put a chest tube in. Now anybody can put a chest tube in. We just have to keep simplifying the technology and simplifying the processes, and we'll be able to bring this to the masses because it's unfortunate that so many people are going to die between 10 years ago and 10 years from now, between the early adopters and the laggards who decide to adopt this because, oh, it's too hard or it's too this. And there's just going to be a lot of body bags that do not need to be filled. So
Now, is there a role for public education and advocacy so we can drum up perhaps more public support for eCPR?
yeah, I mean, actually, I can tell you the most important thing is Peter Saffer's 1955 CPR. You cannot save a person 60 minutes into their cardiac arrest with ECMO unless they have had really good CPR for 55 minutes. So the public education is that when you see a person suddenly collapse, and even if they look like they're breathing or they look like they're seizing, they very easily could be in cardiac arrest, and you should start CPR, activate 911. There's more and more technology out there that's like on your iWatch or your Apple Watch or all these things that says, hey, you've collapsed,
Mhm.
and it can alert stuff. But that rapid CPR, because if your low flow or your no flow time, which is no CPR, is greater than 5 minutes, you're not a good candidate. And you have to have good CPR for 55 minutes. Now, within starting ECMO and within starting the bypass, what I think is really important is that I want to say it's like Jan Belkovic, a guy from Europe, and Dimitri Yiannopoulos were really very responsible for making ECMO be a 2A indication under American Heart Association. That really helped a lot with getting more people to say, hey, we should be offering eCPR at our institution, because now American Heart Association is saying what everybody's been doing is not the number one indication. If you have the ability to do ECMO, you should do ECMO, not amiodarone, for VTAC, VFib arrest, refractory VTAC, VFib arrest. And so the ability for some of the really big powerhouses around the nation to move American Heart Association to say, hey, should we raise these levels to even higher? And then once those levels are higher, hospital administration will say, yes, now we need to have this at X hospital or Y hospital because it's the standard of care for managing things. The other thing ECMO is amazing for is massive pulmonary embolism. Massive pulmonary embolism kills a lot of people. In 2016, at our institution, we had an 80% mortality rate. Since 2017, if you're not in cardiac arrest, you do not die at the University of New Mexico from a massive PE. We put 100% of our massive pulmonary embolism on ECMO if they're candidates. They're not older, too old, or too many comorbidities or whatever, that kind of stuff. But if they're a candidate for ECMO, we put them on and then they get their clot sucked out. And, that's not quite eCPR, but it's another example of how good ECMO is at saving people who previously died.
We're talking to Jon Marinaro. He's a critical care physician. Today's Kevin MD article is The Hidden Flaws of Traditional CPR, Why We Need a New Approach to Save Lives. Jon, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the take home message is if you're a physician, if you're a critical care physician, emergency physician, actually, the other great group would probably be trauma physicians because they're in the hospital 24 hours a day, kind of people who are always at the hospital. You can't have a call in like, hey, I'll be there in 20, 30, 40 minutes. You got to have the people who like live at the hospital. And again, it's, if you're a shift working trauma surgeon, shift working critical care doc, shift working ER doc, somebody is in the hospital 24 hours a day who can then apply this technology quickly. So if you're one of those docs, take the time, go to an ECMO class, learn how to be an ECMO cannulator. It's not hard. It's just getting over a little hump, and then work with your institution to create the infrastructure so that you have a robust cardiac resuscitation program with your nurses running your CPR and your ACLS, and with your physicians cannulating and getting these people on, and you will save lives. And it's a great opportunity for the medical community to hinge on what Peter Safar did in 1955 and what Lance Becker and Paul Pepe did in 2000 to finally move the needle further forward on cardiac arrest survival.
Jon, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.